what we'll do is we will conclude the lecture section of what we're doing this morning, and then go to a question or answer format or reflections. It doesn't have to be question and answers. But what we're going to do now may seem like it is ancillary, that it is not right on point. But believe me, it is central. It is central to all religious thought. It would not make any difference if you're a Jew or a Buddhist or a Muslim or a Christian, and it is particularly central to the dynamic that must be employed in order to reflect on Jesus' teachings in relationship to the problem of violence and how you or I would have to deal with that in this life. How to reflect on that honestly. Jesus refers to himself as the way, the truth, and the life. Gandhi entitled his autobiography An Experiment in Truth. His attempt with life was to see what would happen if a human being, one human being, simply did not lie. Martin Buber, from the Jewish tradition, refers to the lie, as the central sin that human beings bring into the universe. When I was at Notre Dame teaching, I used to teach some things by Cardinal Newman, and Cardinal Newman has a section where he says, let heaven and earth fall before I lie. And the students would say, come on, let heaven and earth fall before I lie. Lie all the time. Okay. At one fundamental level, there really is something wrong with lying, isn't there? If someone says to me, I'm here in Minneapolis, and someone says to me, what is the way to Wisconsin? And I say, go west. I've lied, huh? I know I've lied. And there's something very wrong about that in the sense that we each want to use our time meaningfully. And if I find such and such a thing to do with my life meaningful, and I ask you for directions on how to do it, and you intentionally mislead me, this is not right. This is obviously not right. There's something very wrong about that. However, what Buber and Gandhi and so forth, Newman, are talking about is something far more fundamental than that. When they're talking about let heaven and earth fall before I lie, or what would happen if one person simply was truthful to himself in the human situation, or when Buber says the lie is the central sin that the human being brings into the universe. First of all, let's define a lie. It's kind of embarrassing almost to give the philosophical definition of a lie. A lie. The philosophical definition of a lie is that a lie is the misplacing of the ontological imperative. Now, if that doesn't turn you on, what is the ontological imperative? The ontological imperative is. A lie is the misplacing of the word is. To say something is that is not, to intentionally say something is that is not, that you believe is not, is to lie. Okay? And so, we may do it the other way. We may ask, what is truth? A nice philosophical definition of truth is the conformity of mind to reality. Truth is the conformity of mind to reality. To the extent that mind conforms to reality, indeed, the person is participating in truth. So, this may be, at this point here, conceptually the most difficult part of the workshop to deal with, but it really is worth hanging on to till we get through it. Because it does mean something in terms of not just Christian nonviolence, but your whole religious development. Regardless of whether a person is Aristotle or a local guy down at the local barroom waxing somewhat less than eloquently on the problems of the world, all human thought begins with what we call self-evident first principles or truths or premises. Self-evident first truths or premises. That is, they are truths that are true not because I have proved them to be true, logically. Human thought begins with truths that are true because they are evident to the self as true. A million people can say they are not true, but if you experience them as true, they are true to you. All human thought begins with self-evident truth, whether one is employing mathematical language or alphabetical language. Makes no difference. Now, after we establish what are our premises, our first truths, our first premises, then we apply our logic, then we get our conclusions, then we can make our conclusions operational, and we can even get statistics on how we're doing. All this, from this point on, all this can be checked by a second party, a party outside ourselves. There are rules of logic. We can check whether they're being applied or not, outside the person. Others can do it. When those rules of logic are applied to the first premises, we can check if, in fact, these are the conclusions that must follow. And we can check outside ourselves. Someone else can check whether the conclusions are being made operational. And indeed, whether the statistics or the small sampling techniques or whatever it is that we're using are in fact valid. All this, from this point down, can be checked outside the self. But at this point here, at the beginning point, one is left alone with oneself and alone with God. What, in fact, do I know is true self-evidently? And herein lies the problem. For what happens if at this point here, where no one can check me but me, what happens if I lie to myself? If I say that I know something is true, that I know in my heart is untrue. A lie, misplacing of the word is. Is the word that points to reality. A lie is a non-reality to me then. Huh? It's an illusion to me. I am saying something is true that I know is false. But I'm saying it at a level where no one can check me. I'm saying it at the level of first truths, first premises. Now watch what happens. From this point on, I can apply the logic. I can reach conclusions. I can make my conclusions operational. And I can even get statistics. And all this, from this point, from the logic on, can be checked by a second party, a party outside myself, and check out perfectly. I can make an absolutely impeccable use of logic, reach impeccable conclusions logically, have the operation follow precisely from the conclusions, and get all the proper statistics using the right sampling techniques and so forth. And outside, it checks out 100% correctly. The only problem is I have begun the process with an illusion, with what I know is a lie, a non-reality. This is what Aldous Huxley refers to as resulting in madness. Madness in reason's mask. Madness in reason's mask. And so, when we take a look at this process here, it becomes obvious, you know, what Dan Berrigan, for example, meant when he said that in the world of religion, statistics are the last bastion of the infirm mind. It makes no difference how many people are doing what. That's irrelevant. This is the place where the whole spiritual struggle takes place. And not that you can be illogical and so forth, but this is the heart of the matter. Because if we fool ourselves here, we're in real trouble. Note what happens if we fool ourselves here. Newman, let heaven and earth fall before I lie. For indeed, heaven and earth will fall. You will create a world that is utterly inconsistent with what you fundamentally know is reality. And it will be a hell on earth for you. And if enough people create it, it will be a communal hell on earth. This is what Gandhi is talking about being honest with oneself. And so Gandhi, how many public people can do this? How many religious people can do this? Gandhi, it was pointed out to him that he had made 3 statements over a period of about 12 years, and the 3 of them tended to contradict each other about what was true. And Gandhi responded, he said, the truth is the last statement. And, you know, people went bananas, you know, and he said, no. No, he said, all it means is I've learned something. And as I experience reality and something no longer comes out as true, I cannot continue to say it's true. This is not done haphazardly or arbitrarily, but this is the human situation. To be forever stuck at a point as calling something true, even when I no longer see it as true, just because I've called it true in the past, is absurd. Utterly absurd. We would still be saying the earth is flat. That's not the way human evolution, human development, the human being goes individually or collectively. There's no hope in that process. And so, also here. How many people say that all kinds of things are true that in their heart they know simply are not true? They are false, but they say them because indeed they've been saying them so long as true that they're afraid what the world would be if they ever changed their mind. So, this is a kind of a schematic approach to the problem. Huh? What is the name of the problem? In philosophy, the name of this problem is the problem of bad faith. That doesn't mean that Buddhist faith is good and Christian faith is bad. It means that the individual has chosen at the level where only he knows or she knows, has chosen a faith stance that they do not believe is true, and therefore it's bad for them. Because it's against the grain of their consciousness, their existence. It's not consistent with how they must develop. The name for this in religious, in spiritual terms is the problem of religious self-deception. Religious self-deception. The deceiving of oneself about the truth, the truths of the truth at the center of one's religious life. What I have here are a few definitions of religious self-deception that I've garnered from different places, okay? This is kind of a skeletal outline. But what this is, the purpose of these few definitions is to give a sense of the nuance and indeed how tricky the problem is to work with. First definition. I'll read them so if you can't see because of the light. First definition. Self-deception is to intentionally persuade oneself to believe what one knows is not the truth. What you will see in each of these definitions is that religious self-deception is not a subconscious process. For it to exist, for bad faith to exist, there must be an element of conscious intentionality. That is, that one chooses against what one knows is not so at a level that no one could ever positively say you are lying to yourself. That is at the first premise level. To intentionally persuade, you must work at it. That what one knows, or that to believe what one knows is not the truth. Or this one. The self-deceiver persuades himself or herself to believe contrary to the evidence. Very important. We're not talking about a phenomena for which there is no evidence. We're talking about the evidence is out there to go in another direction. For example, Christ saying, put up the sword, he who lives by the sword dies by the sword, and going to the cross, forgiving, praying. The self-deceiver persuades himself or herself to believe contrary to the evidence. Why? What's the motivation behind doing this? In order to evade somehow unpleasant and unwanted truths. There are truths in this life that we simply do not want to see. We would rather not know them. We would rather play the ostrich because, to go on the next line, he or she has already seen the truths to which the evidence points. It is a way of attempting to evade distress or maximize satisfaction. None of us wants to change. None of us wants trouble. None of us wants pain. None of us wants difficulty. No one does. Not one of us. And so, the self-deceiver, when a truth is known, the attempt is to intentionally evade it because I want to keep the satisfaction patterns I have, religious or secular, or I want to evade pain. But the truths are there with evidence. With evidence. Sartre talks about self-deception as requiring for its existence to become a life's project. A life's project. It's not just something that happens once, but what you know is true will bear in on you and bear in on you, and therefore you must keep working at putting something else in your mind over and over and over again. How about this one? The self-deceiver is one who lies with sincerity, who convinces himself or herself of what even then is known not to be so. Sincerity is no test of truth. Absolutely no test at all. The Nazis were sincere. As a matter of fact, sincerity can be one of the great cover-ups. No. Sincerity is not what the issue is. The issue is, am I sincere or not sincere? That's irrelevant. But am I working at convincing myself of what I know at this moment is not true? Or this. Self-deception is making oneself the work again, huh? The work. You have to work at it, not a subconscious process. Making oneself believe or forget. Forgetfulness is a wonderful way of deceiving oneself. I just fill my mind up with other things. I just forget it. Self-deception is making oneself believe or forget, not a little detail, huh? But something of critical importance. That points overwhelmingly to conclusions opposite to the ones adopted by the self-deceiver. Forget the cross. Forget he who lives by the sword dies. Forget forgive 70 times 70. Forget love your enemy. Pray for those who persecute you. So you heard it said of old, eye for an eye, but I say, etc., 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 etc. Making oneself believe or forget something of critical importance. That I don't know how to overcome death. That I don't know how to overcome evil. That if Jesus is in fact the Son of God, if he says who we believe, if he is who we say we believe he is, then the same entity that spoke the words of the Sermon on the Mount, that same entity is the entity that brought the universe into creation, and the seriousness of that. Self-deception, making oneself believe or forget something of critical importance, which points overwhelmingly, not maybe, or to conclusions opposite the ones adopted by the self-deceiver. Self-deception, self-deceiver. He or she is one for whom there is nothing to be seen, because he or she knows very well that there is something unbearably distressing to be seen. I remember, this is a true story, a woman, when the, what was his name, Gary Gilmore was executed, when the executions to the capital punishment. I remember I was talking to a woman that day, and she said, well, it's a good thing that the Christian woman, and she said, well, it's a good thing the hangman finally got it. He deserves it, and so forth. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And I happened to say, I said, well, you know, Jesus has something to say on that. I talked for a little bit. Could you really picture Jesus standing behind one of those guns, pointing it at his heart, and pulling the trigger to blow him out of existence? And we talked on, and I said, look, Jesus, I said, eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And I went in and I got the Bible and I opened it up and I said, look, here's what Jesus said. You heard it said of old, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you. And then, you know, go the other mile, turn the other cheek, and so on and on and on. And the woman said to me, she said, Catholic lady, she says, don't give me that New Testament stuff. God help me, she said, if I ever started reading the New Testament, I'd have no religion at all. Truth. But she's not the only one. She's not the only one. She just has a simplistic way of saying it. Well, how about this as a final one? The self-deceiver is one who resolutely refuses to look at his or her beliefs because he or she knows very well that they won't see what they want to see. Just refuse to look. Hey, look, I've been going to church for 40 years. I've heard sermons, you know, look, hey, if this nonviolence was part of what Christ taught, it certainly would have, I would have heard it in some church, someplace, somewhere, you know. I haven't heard it. I've never heard it. Well, pick up the scripture. See what Jesus. I don't have to pick up. I know what's there. Oh, well, what do the words mean? What do the words mean? Love your enemy. Pray for those who persecute you. Do good to those who hate you. What does the model of Jesus seem to suggest? Hey, I know what it's all about. I've been a Catholic for 45 years. Well, can't you look? You know? No? Self-deceiver is one who resolutely refuses to look at his or her beliefs, because he or she knows very well that they won't see what they want to see. Now, there's just one more little dimension of this that I'd like to raise, and then we'll stop for the question and answer period, and that's this. What is the situation when this occurs? Someone lies to him or herself, right, at the point of self-evident truth, builds the whole world for him or herself. Another person tells the same lie to him or herself and builds a consistent world, and finally you have 3, 4, 5, 10 people involved in the same lie, which would not be hard to do. Why? Because the tendency is, remember the definition, what we want to do is, we're people that tend to want to work on pleasure-pain principles. And if we see pain on the horizon, or if we see pleasure being taken away, or if we see change coming, the tendency is that it's easier to start twisting and bending truth than we otherwise would. So let's say, for an example, that a little community of people, individually, they lie to themselves, and then they begin to build a theology and the structures to go with that. Now, here's the point that I want to make. What happens at the point that a child is born into that community? Something different is about to take place. And we've got to be very conscious of this, because the child is not in the same position as the people who originally lied to themselves. The child is now going to be nurtured in a world from childhood on forward where certain perceptions and understandings and interpretations of existence are going to be given by the entire community as fact, as irrefutable fact. And then if we just pass this down 1, 2, 3, or 4 generations, just a short period of time, we've simply got an absolutely tight community, and we are no longer talking about self-deception anymore. For example, I grew up in an Irish Catholic ghetto, and I joined the Marine Corps. And I joined the Marine Corps, and it never occurred to me to choose nonviolence, to think of pacifism, to do anything but join the Marine Corps. Nonviolence, it wasn't a choice against it, it was a non-thought. The thought did not exist for me to choose. I was nurtured in an Irish Catholic community, Catholic schools for 22, till I was 22 years old when I did this, 21 years old. And it just never occurred to me. I didn't deceive myself about nonviolence. I never heard about it. In a community of cannibals, it is a non-thought not to be a cannibal. That's all. It's just not possible under normal circumstances. And so what happens, mind you, if someplace down here in a community of cannibals, say down here in the 4th, 5th generation, some cannibal person happens to see another human being being destroyed and eaten, even ritually, and begins to think, you know, that human being is like myself. He or she had a family and they had friends and they want to live like I do. This doesn't seem right. Remember, we're in a community of cannibals. Now he or she goes back to the community and says, you know, maybe we ought to think about this killing people and eating them. And what does the community say? take a vacation. Calm down, you know. Calm down, you know? So he takes his vacation. He says, but it really not, you know, there's something wrong about this. I know it's normal, you know. I know my religious tradition has said it's been okay, but at this level here, there's something not coming out right. It doesn't seem true anymore. And so he goes back to the community, and he's got better arguments this time. He says to the community, he says, well, you wouldn't like to be someone's meal, would you? And so forth. He makes nice, rational arguments. And so what do they say this time? You need a psychiatrist. You know, you're abnormal. Abnormal. Not a well-balanced person in the cannibal world. Huh? I mean, do you realize what you're saying? You're saying we're indecent people. So he goes to a psychiatrist, huh? And the psychiatrist says, well, it's all right to have those thoughts, but you've got to go along with the society, you know. Right? So he goes back and he says, gee, but if people are dying, if they're being eaten, if they're being killed, you know, something more is needed than the thoughts. I've got to take some sort of action, you know. So he really becomes really intense about this, you know. And by golly, what he does is one day they're about to ritually kill a person, eat a person, he steps in front of the thing and fouls up the whole thing, civil disobedience. Well, you know what they have to do then. It's absolutely essential. We've got to get serious, because this man is upsetting what we know is the way to live and what God's will is. Because cannibalism is religiously legitimatized in that world. Huh? It's consistent with God's will. So they throw him in jail. And if he persists, huh, and if he ever should get to the point of saying, I just don't see how this person is like me, is like you, and I just don't see how God could ever have created the three of us so that we too could eat him. I do not see it. You know what they'd call him? Heretic. Heretic. And if he persisted, they would ultimately have to destroy him somehow. Now, as Thomas Merton points out, in the total scope of human violence, cannibals haven't done 1/1,000,000th of the human violence, lethal violence, that Christians have committed. Not 1/1,000,000th. Cannibals haven't done it. They simply have not done it. They don't do it. Did God make me so that I brought out of nothingness, so that I could maim and destroy you? Does that seem what Christ is proclaiming? At any rate, the point being, after you pass a couple of generations, it is a closed system. Cannibalism becomes a taken for granted reality. And so, the reason I raise this is, the priest that I continually quoting here, the biblical scholar, Father John L. Mackenzie, and I'll mention his books along the line, makes the point of saying that when the church finally rediscovers Jesus' ethic of nonviolent love, it is going to have to realize that it does not know how to implement the ethic. For it has been living in a world of pagan violence for 1,700 years. Because you know what you should do doesn't mean you know how to execute it in real life. And therefore, as he points out, one of the great sufferings the church is going to have to go through is, which is just the suffering of human life, learning by experience, of going down one road and having to come back, trying to implement an understanding of reality that it has no experience in implementing. For the last 1,700 years, if it were implementing this, it'd be a different story. It hasn't been. And so it would be much like in a cannibal world, the day the cannibal world would decide we can't kill, eat people, and so on anymore. Be a traumatic experience on how to function. after centuries upon centuries of functioning in the same way. At any rate, when we talk about discernment, the word discernment, discerning God's will, the tendency is in religious communities, in orders, in families, and in personal life, what we're talking about is discerning down here, you know, the operation or something like this. What should we be doing? Discernment as an ongoing process is up here. Trying to clarify our thought about what we honestly believe to be true about reality, about the mystery of Christ, about the mystery of existence. And then living out of that truth. That is the process of discernment. Christ is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. But our subjectivity isn't, and our experience isn't. We are different today than when we were 10 years old. And if that doesn't make any difference in the way we perceive Christ and Christianity and what we should be about, then there's something wrong. This is the place where we must continually discern, because to lie here literally means heaven and earth falls. So why don't I stop there, and maybe we can talk a little bit about anything you want to talk about. Am I missing? Yes.
To continue on the same subject, if the self-evident premise is the person's own self-evident premise, right, and that premise can change as time goes on. You mentioned how Gandhi's premise changed, or you alluded to the Earth as a flat surface before the time of Galileo and Copernicus. There were a lot of things that were self-evident, but it had to change drastically.
Right.
But then, isn't that self-evident premise really a relative thing? And if that's what truth is, then truth becomes relative. Because it depends on a person's own, what is self-evident to a particular person at a particular time and place.
The subjectivity of the human personality is indeed precisely what the human situation is. And it's precisely why the gospel of Christ is central to the carrying out of the human endeavor. This does not mean that there's not an objective reality there. What it does mean is, in terms of our big circle, that objective reality is approached subjectively. And we'll talk about this we'll spend 45 minutes on it tomorrow morning when we talk about Christian love and the nature of Christian love. But that we are subjects, yes indeed. We are not objects, and not one person in this room has the grasp of objective reality. What he or she has is, from their psyche, one dimension of objective reality. Therefore, the question becomes, if all I have is just my perception of reality as it's come from literally before birth, that is my perception and it is unique, then the question becomes, where do I get the right to say to you, you must live my perception of reality, or else I will hurt you? Why is my perception of reality so good and yours so bad? Why is mine so total and yours so incomplete? Why is mine in conformity with God's will and yours not? Indeed, we can only approach objective reality subjectively, which is what is behind the whole sense of the concept, judge not. Because we do not know what the person has to work with in order to make a choice. What we can talk about is what we should be working with. What we can talk about is we have in Christianity, fortunately, a foundation document, New Testament, which says things in a way that indeed are culture bound, but there is some objectivity that we've got an objective something to approach. But it is truly important to be very, very conscious of the fact that I've got just this tiny subjective view of existence. It's out of that I must build human life. And where in the name of heavens, out of that little dot, do I get the right to say to you, live as I want you to live out of my sense of what's right and true, or I'll slit your throat? Mind you, add one thing to that, where does the collectivity get that right? Just because you have 10, 12, 15, or 100, or a million little dots here, what does a million little dots know of all reality? Just a little bit. And just because numbers say to do it this way, where do they get the right to say, do it this way or I'll slit your throat? How do they know? It's a most delicate matter, but it's very, very important to recognize that it's just that little bit of dot, that this here, anything that is self-evident, anything that is self-evident to me, indeed, if that is truth, that is what I must live. I've got no choice. Why? Because human beings are creatures of meaning. Meaning. There is an absolute, irrevocable, it cannot be separated. There is no way of separating these dynamics, truth and meaning. Why? Truth is reality. As far as I know reality, it's in my sense of truth. To live in a non-reality is ipso facto unmeaningful. So that if I have one perception of what is true, and you have another perception of what is true, but I happen to have the might, the power, the dominative power, to hurt you, and I say, you must live my conception of truth. You must live what I think is real, what I think is true, but you don't believe what I think is true. You see what I'm doing to you? I'm reducing your life to meaninglessness. And boy, you better have drugs or booze or something around, tiddlywinks, to get your mind off it, because a meaningless life is a hell on earth. And how much of that is going on? That is the non-recognition of the intimate relationship between truth and meaning, and people forcing other people to live their truths. Why? Probably because we live in a world of a quantity consciousness, The more people that believe as we believe, the surer we feel, the more secure we feel. Well, that's a lot of baloney. Thomas Merton says, it is the diabolical quality in the human being that wants others to be like him. I don't want anyone to be, you can't be me. We'll talk about tomorrow, about when we talk about human uniqueness. You can't be me. For me to want you to be me, it's wrong. You want me. So what are we dealing with here? We're dealing with a most serious issue. To force a truth on you that you do not believe is true. A reality that you believe is unreality, is illusion, is a non-reality, is to force you into a meaningless existence. And human beings are creatures of meaning. And so the judge not, the nonviolence, is all based on fundamentally living it yourself, offering a people an understanding of it, both by your words and your deeds, but not forcing it on anybody. Not forcing it on anybody. And as we'll talk about tomorrow morning when we talk about Christian love, the minute that there is anything that attacks the integrity of human freedom, attacks the integrity of the Christian life. And it's all tied into the fact that one must live one's truth in order to have meaning. If one lies to oneself, well, that's one's business. Failure to live one's truth, whatever that might be, is to condemn oneself to a world of the hell of unmeaning. Yes?
Disobedience as a non-violent political commitment to the consistency of a society in clear deterioration. Christians, educated ones, seeking within leaderships that have shown their consistent and solid teachings, Karl Kabat and Martin Luther King. I repeat, civil disobedience as a non-violent political commitment to the consistency of a society in clear deterioration. Christians, educated ones, seeking within leaderships that have shown their consistent and solid teachings, Karl Kabat and Martin Luther King.
I know Karl Kabat, but I'm not sure what the first part of the question or statement was. Do you want to read it again?
Yes, civil disobedience as a non-violent political commitment to the consistency of a society in clear deterioration. Christian educated ones seeking within leaderships that have shown their consistent and solid teachings as Karl Kabat and Martin Luther King.
If I'm hearing you correctly, what you're saying is, and if I'm not hearing you correctly, that is that Christian civil disobedience should be a commitment of Christians in a society that is clearly in deterioration, and that people like Karl Kabat and Martin Luther King should be the models of leadership in such a Christian world. Contemporary times, right now. And I would tend to agree with that, with the understanding that when we talk about the political side of this afternoon, I would say that's right, just in terms of generally, yeah. Yes? Oh, I'm sorry.
Care to comment upon accepting the lesser of two evils in making decisions in relationship to the first 300 years of Christianity in which that was offered?
The lesser of two evils we talk about tomorrow morning too with Christian love, but at least let me give an introductory comment on it. It was the understanding, and is the understanding, of the early Christian church, and of that dimension of the Christian church that is Pacific at the moment, that one lives in a world where one is utterly surrounded by evil, and where evil is affecting one continuously. It is also the understanding of the Pacific world and of the early church that all evil is social evil. Sin. All sin is social sin. There is no private sin. That's foolishness. We can't sit here and say that the lustful thought is private sin. It is not. The lustful thought is social sin. People become what they think. Nurture the angry thought, nurture the lustful thought, nurture the jealous thought, nurture the greedy thought, and you become an angry, lustful, greedy person, and that has social consequences. We become what we think, what we desire. And so, since sin is social sin, we do not know the social consequences of any sin. All we know is all sin has social consequences. So, for example, I tell the true story of a man back in Boston who, a Christian man, driving down the street one morning, going to work, he ran over a 5-year-old child and killed the child. Now, what took place was, he had about 200 feet when he could have seen that child. And it wasn't that the child came out from behind the cars. The child was in the middle of the street playing. And there was a good, clear 200 feet, and he did not see the child and ran right over her. Okay. What was happening? In the manslaughter trial, what came out was he wasn't drinking or anything like that. It was 8:45 in the morning or something. The previous night, he had had an extended argument with his daughter. For the last 6 or so months around the neighborhood, there had been talk that his daughter was involved with drugs and sexual promiscuity. His daughter was a senior in high school. She had a scholarship to a college, but away from home. As the talk generated in the neighborhood, the gossip, what he did was he became, of course, aware of it. And that night before, he had confronted the daughter with it. The daughter had denied it, and he just said, well, so-and-so said it, and he heard it here, and he heard it there, and so forth. And he told her that she couldn't take the scholarship at the school where she wanted to go. And there was a big to-do about it and so forth. That morning, as he was driving down the street, his mind was totally prepossessed by the problem of the daughter and the gossip and so forth. He never saw the child. As it turns out, it was all a lie. It was all a fabrication. Whether out of malice, or people were bored, or they had nothing to do. But the point is, who killed the child? The man in the car, or the people that started or continued the gossip? Last year down in Connecticut, a man was unemployed for 5 weeks. 5 weeks he was unemployed. Never been unemployed in his life. Came home from the unemployment office one day, took a hatchet and killed his 5 children, his wife, his mother, and himself. How much unlove did that man had to experience to come to that moment? How much darkness? If you've ever had to deal with people, or you've ever dealt yourself with unemployment offices and so forth and so on, the state can be a hell on earth. Or social service offices and so forth. How much unkindness in going to jobs and rejection. How many people had to slam on a horn as he kind of perhaps didn't walk at the stoplight the proper way or something. How many people yelled at him driving by? How many acts of unlove led to the moment where he snapped? There is no private sin. The very point of original sin and what redemption is all about is, once we sin, we do not know where the ripples are going, but we know they're going, and we can't get them back. Therefore, out of that kind of consciousness, what is perceived is that in any given instant of time, the choice is never between the lesser of evils. The choice is always for good. First of all, because who can calculate evil? Who has the formula? Who has the insight to say that this evil only causes this much evil in the future, and this evil causes this much? That's impossible. There is no formula to calculate evil. The littlest, most insignificant evil can cause the greatest harm in the situation, maybe in a generation or two. There is no way to calculate the effects of evil. All talk about proportionality is purely illusionary. It's proportionality from this little tiny perspective that we have of time and space. A day, a half hour, a year, or something like that. There's no way to talk about proportionality in evil. We don't know the seriousness of any piece of evil. But what we do have available to us in any given moment is the opportunity to respond in that moment as Christ would have responded. And that is a choice for good. That may cost us our lives, as we'll talk about this afternoon. That may cost us our job. That may make us late. for work, but there is always the opportunity to respond as Christ would have responded in the moment. In the moment. But once we get into this business of calculating good and evil, as we'll talk about tomorrow morning, we are in an impossible world. Thomas Merton, the first and most important thing to live the Christian life is to be your own good person here and now, and then be willing to let everything fall in its own good time, good place, and good way. Love here, and let the ripples go out. There's no calculating good and evil in the human situation. What we do have in our control is now to love as Christ would have loved, and then be willing to let the ripples go out. We'll talk about this extensively tomorrow morning, but as a start to an answer. Yes, you had, right.
I need to ask a structural question. This is something that's been going on inside me since last night. I love the structure that you did here, but my question is this. I know there's a woman in the church. I know that the church, in my experience, is that structurally, in its very essence, structurally, it is sexist.
You're right.
Structurally, I am unequal.
That's right.
Structurally, I have been lived and taught about the lie from the very beginning. That institutions, theology, ritual, ordination, and on it goes, tells me that I'm not equal. My question is, when I'm up against a structure, whether it's in my society, through advertising, that sets me up to be promiscuous,
Right.
that sets me up to be a whore, a slut, a prostitute, that sets me up to be unequal in the church, what do I do as a single person against the massive structures when my gut wants to tell me run away because it's of tolerance?
I think that's a central question that every Christian must face, because every Christian finds him or herself in some set of structures, inside or outside the church, that indeed are structures that are saying to him or her that you are something different from what you believe yourself and know yourself to be. Christ himself found that. Being centered in Judaism of his time, indeed, we find right in the very Gospels where he says, the Jewish institution says this, but I say this. All right. Dorothy Day, it seems to me, has the best answer to this, at least the answer that I live. And that is, in terms of the church now, we'll just stay with the church. She says, what we must do is we must build the new in the shell of the old. If a person is going to stay within the church, then it is very, very important that the person not stay in as a silent witness to what one doesn't believe. That's very important. If you are to stay in, then it means you stay in with love indeed. You must speak the truth with love, but the truth must be spoken. And therefore, to take the sexist issue, there is no question the church is a sexist church. It's just no question at all. The way that women have been treated for 2,000 years and are presently treated is absolutely inconsistent with any understanding of equality except an understanding of equality that is fundamentally patriarchal. Right? One can prescind from the intense theological question of ordination and just look at everything for, I don't know how it is here, but in the Boston Archdiocese, everything from altar girls to various forms of baptism to just on and on and on, which have no theological basis at all, no possible theological basis. And they're still done. And so the question becomes one of, it seems like that the approach of Dorothy Day, build the new within the shell of the old, to speak the truth by word and deed with love within the shell of the old, seems like at one level it may be a cop-out. But at another level, if we can think about it a little bit, my experience, it is a far more onerous burden to day in, day out, hour in, hour out, month in, month out, year in, year out, to stand up, to speak out with love as it must be done, and to be rejected, than simply to step outside the whole thing and lose a voice and simply... there is no 5-year plan on how to do this. But unless one thinks the church is entirely wrong, which I don't, then what one is about is correcting the aspects that are wrong. Using the aspects that are right to correct the aspects that are wrong. In other words, to use a phrase, we don't want to leave the church to the snake. That is, if everyone who really sees the seriousness of the evil of sexism simply walks out of the church, you know what's going to happen.